Okay, so let's talk about the introduction to pulmonary airway physiology. I'll just quickly review some of the concepts that you guys should already be pretty familiar with. But let's just go ahead and talk about the general anatomy of the airway. So when we talk about the airway, it's divided basically into two components. You have your upper airway, okay, and you have your lower airway. And where is the dividing line between the upper and lower airway? Okay, yep, the. What is that? What are you pointing at?
Calculate.
Yeah, pretty much.
It says I read it.
Basically, a good rule of thumb is once you pass through the glottis, okay, so once you pass through the glottis, you pass through the vocal cords, you have transitioned into the lower airway. Okay, so basically from your nose down to your glottic aperture, that's all considered upper airway. And then from your glottic aperture down to the peripheral parts of your airway is considered your lower airway. Is everybody cool with that? Now, when we talk about the upper and lower airway, we can subdivide those a little bit, okay, into two different components. You have what are known as your conducting. Okay, we know these are known as your conducting airways. And then you have your diffusing airways. Okay, so your conducting airways, the purpose of the conducting airways is to conduct, to move, to transport bulk amounts of gas from the atmosphere into the peripheral parts of the lungs. And the role of the diffusing airways, these are the peripheral parts of the lungs, the diffusing airways are less about moving bulk amounts of gas around and more about what? There you go. Diffusion of gas across the alveolar capillary membrane. Primarily the diffusion of oxygen across that membrane into the pulmonary circulation, and the diffusion of carbon dioxide from the pulmonary circulation out into the alveoli. And then that air then goes back into the conducting airways and it's conducted outside of the body. Is everybody cool with that? And from what's your first branch? So here I have my lower airway. What's that first branch called? Right here. Yeah, that's known as a carina. Everybody's cool with that? So from that first branch, it branches out into your right and your left mainstem bronchus, right? Everybody's cool with that? And then your bronchus branches out into bronchioles, and then those branch out, okay? And they get smaller and smaller and smaller and more numerous until eventually you get to what's known as the terminal bronchiole. All right, you get back down to the terminal bronchiole, and you transition into the alveoli themselves. All right, and just kind of worthless knowledge, from the carina down to the alveoli, you have approximately 23 what we call generations. Okay, approximately 23 generations. So basically what that means is you have, if I'm a molecule of oxygen here, that molecule of oxygen will go through 23 different bifurcations before it gets to the alveoli. That's what a generation is, bifurcation. Okay? Is everybody okay? Cool so far? Awesome. Stop me if you have questions. I don't want this to be a confusing class, but there we go. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and briefly review the upper airway, okay? This is all stuff that you should be familiar with at this point. You should be familiar with the nose, right? What the nose does, the nose is a heating, warming, it's a warming, humidifying, filtering device, right? It's a big filter. Nose is full of hair. Further back into the nose, we actually have cilia, okay? You have mucus and you have membranes that can respond to irritation. Okay, so the main role of the nose is to heat, humidify, and filter the air coming into the body. Everybody's cool with that? All right, the air then goes back into the nose, into the first cavity, if you will. And what is that first cavity, right, kind of posterior to the nose called?
Is it the Glottis?
No.
Nasal cavity?
Pharynx. There you go, the nasal pharynx, right? You have the nasal pharynx. And then you drop down to the posterior part of the mouth, and you have what's known as the oral pharynx, right? And then you drop down into the lower part of the upper airway, and that is known as the laryngeal pharynx, so the laryngeal pharynx, right? So you have nasal, oral, and laryngeal pharynx. Just basic A&P review there. Okay. You also have sinuses you talked about that are associated with the upper airways. You have, like maxillary sinuses. And you also know that your ears are connected to your upper airway as well, right? And what structure connects your ears to your upper airway? You have one structure on each side. And then these actually dump out into the upper airway. That's how you equalize pressure in your middle ear, and how. And if you get really bad allergies, you get a really bad cold, and your ears get plugged up, it's because these structures get inflamed and plugged up with stuff. No? Nobody? Bueller? No? Okay. The eustachian tubes. The eustachian tubes connect the middle and inner ear with the upper airway. Okay? They drain out into the upper airway. Okay, so when we look at the upper airway, you guys should be familiar with this. I actually have some models that I'll show you in lab this afternoon, where we actually have cut the airway open, and you can actually see coronal slices of the airway. So we'll look at that as well. But you should be familiar with where the tongue is, right? What the role of the tongue is. The teeth, okay? And then as you go further back, of course, you have what's called the uvula, right? And the uvula, you can see in the back of the throat. You have the tonsils and the tonsillar pillars. And we know that the tonsils can be a problem because they can become inflamed, and we call that tonsillitis. Tonsils, you have different sets of them, right? You have the tonsils you can see, and then further back you have what are called the adenoid tonsils as well. And sometimes those tissues can frequently get inflamed, and occasionally have to be surgically removed, and what's known as a tonsillectomy, or some people call it TNA, a tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy, where they remove all of those. Those, of course, what kind of tissues are those? What kind of tissues are your tonsils? It's lymphatic tissue. Your tonsils are lymphatic tissue. They're involved in the immune system. They are a type of lymph node in a sense. So it makes sense that they would get swollen and inflamed when you have some sort of infectious or inflammatory pathology occurring. Okay, you guys should all know what the epiglottis is. What is the epiglottis? What does it do? What is its role? Right, yeah. So when you swallow, the epiglottis covers what? What is that called? What is that structure called? What does epi mean? What does epi mean?
Above.
Above. So epi means above glottis. So it would, if you think about it, the epiglottis would cover the glottis, right? Okay, and the glottis, of course, is the opening to the trachea. When you look at the glottis, you should be able to identify basic structures of the glottis, okay? Which we will be doing in lab with anatomical models. So if I look, well, I'm looking into the glottis, so this would be posterior, and this would be anterior or dorsal ventral. Okay, I'm looking at the glottis, so I'm laying down, mouth is open, I'm looking down into the glottis, straight on like this, okay? So what should I see? Well, I should see something that looks kind of like this, all right? picture in your book. Okay, so look at that picture. Okay, so anterior part. What structure is right here? Right here. I'll give you a hint. This right here is where the epiglottis is. All right. This is where the epiglottis is. It's anterior, and I've pushed the epiglottis up out of the way so I can actually see the glottis. So what is this little valley here between the epiglottis and the glottis? What is this little valley here? This is an important area to identify when it comes to intubation. No. No. And it literally means little valley. The word literally means little valley. There you go, the vallecula. That's the vallecula, yeah. All right, that's a vallecula. Okay. There's a little ligament there, and one of the types of laryngoscopes is designed to actually fit into the vallecula. You fit it into the vallecula, and you hit that little ligament, and it pops the epiglottis up. Or that's what it's supposed to happen. Okay, so now we've done that. Now we're looking. So what are these thin white things right here, with a thin line white in the middle? Those are the vocal cords. All right, or sometimes people call these the vestibular folds. All right, and what would be this dark area right in here? Yeah, this is the glottic aperture. Okay, this is the glottis, the glottic aperture, and that is the entrance or the opening of the trachea. Everybody's good with that? Okay, and then I have these little muscular region here that the vocal cords are attached to, and those are sometimes known as, we call them the false vocal cords. And then I have cartilage here on the posterior aspect of the glottis. I have different types of cartilage that give structure down here. Okay, you have two large bulbous-looking cartilage, and I believe it's labeled in your book. Is that correct? Yeah. Those are known as the corniculate cartilages, and the reason they're called the corniculate cartilage is because they kind of look like kernels of corn. Okay, so you have the corniculate cartilage. All right, and then toward the midline, you have two smaller sets of cartilage known as the arytenoid cartilage. All right, the arytenoid cartilage, and then there's a little notch right here, a little notch in between the arytenoid cartilage known as the arytenoid notch. All that stuff's in the book there? Yeah. Okay, and then down here, what structure do I have in the most posterior part of the view? Yeah, they do have a hyoid bone, but you can't see that when you're looking into the glottis. Huh? No, the tongue, you can't actually, because we've gotten past the tongue, right? The tongue's pulled up out of the way, epiglottis is pulled up out of the way. So I have two holes, right? I have my lung hole and I have my gut hole, right? We've already talked about the lung hole. What is the most posterior hole? The esophagus. I got my gut hole, right? So I got my lung hole here, I got my gut hole here, all right? And when it comes to intubation, it's going to be really important to get the tube into the lung hole and not the gut hole, right? So you guys need to be able to identify these structures, and guess what? You're going to have quizzes where I'm going to have photographs of these views, and you'll need to be able to properly identify those structures. That's why I talk about it a little bit. Okay, let's talk about the neck. So once I transition through the glottis, I go into the trachea. And the upper part of the trachea is kind of wrapped in a cartilaginous structure called the larynx, right? And you guys can feel that, okay? And you have two large sets of cartilage. You have the most proximal, the further up, that's the big part that kind of juts out. Some people call that the Adam's apple. That's known as the thyroid cartilage, right? And then right underneath the thyroid cartilage, you have a little valley, right? So if I were to feel this, and we'll actually be doing this in the lab, feeling for it and looking at it. Okay, so I have this big set of cartilage, I have a little valley, and then I have another piece of cartilage there, all right? So it looks something like that. This big cartilage is the thyroid. Everybody's okay with that? All right, that's the thyroid cartilage. And then, of course, on the lateral aspects of the thyroid cartilage, what glands do you have? You have the thyroid glands and you have the parathyroid glands, which just are much smaller and sit a little posterior to the thyroid. Thyroids and parathyroids. This is looking at it from the side. And then what's this little structure in the valley here? This little valley that kind of comes in. This is called the cricoid membrane. Yes, very important structure. Very important structure when it comes to airway management. We'll talk about it in a little more detail. And then you have one more cartilage, another set of cartilage underneath the cricoid membrane. And what is that cartilage known as? The cricoid cartilage. All right, so when you look at the larynx, this whole thing is collectively known as the larynx. All right, you have the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid membrane, and the cricoid cartilage, which is the most posterior. Is everybody cool with that? So far, so good? All right, I know this is probably a lot of review for some people, but it sounds like maybe we kind of need to review those basic concepts. Okay, cool. All right, so now as I transition down, okay, so now here I am in the trachea, and we know that the upper airways are what we call cartilaginous tissues, right? Everybody's okay with that? You have rings, okay? And those rings provide support and structure. And what happens is, the lower I go down into the airways, and as I move toward the alveoli, the less and less cartilage I have. So I start off with lots of cartilage in my airways, and that cartilage becomes less and less frequent until I get down to the terminal airways, where I don't have any cartilage at all, and it's just muscle. It's just muscle and airway tissue. Okay, is everybody okay with that? So when we talk about something like bronchospasm with asthma or COPD, you cannot have bronchospasm of your trachea, right? Or can you? What do you guys think? I'll pose that question to you. Can you have bronchospasm occur in your trachea? What do you think? Really? Doesn't exist. You can't have bronchospasm in your trachea. What is bronchospasm? Bronchospasm is when the little muscle, because you have little areas of muscle that wrap around the airways, right? When those muscles contract, okay, that squeezes the airways off, right? Narrows them. Can you have that occur in your upper airways?
No, because of the crank.
You have cartilage. You have rings of cartilage. You have lots of cartilage. Now, your trachea can swell shut. It can swell up and shut off. Absolutely, you can get swelling, okay? And you can have mucus that can plug it up. Absolutely. But you can't have spasm of those highly cartilaginous airways. So bronchospasm is a phenomenon that occurs down in your lower non-cartilaginous airways. Does that kind of make sense? Everybody cool with that? And that's why you hear that wheezing, whereas when you have narrowing of your upper airways, it's almost always an inflammatory kind of process or a foreign body or something like that, and you hear stridor instead. Everybody's cool with that? All right. So as I move down the airways, the airway lining is interesting, and I actually have a microscope set up in lab this afternoon, and I have slides of airway tissue, both upper airway and lower airway tissue that you guys will be taking a look at. And they're stained. I was able to stain them real nice, so the structures really show up well. But if you just look at the structure of basically from the trachea down to the alveoli, okay? The trachea down to the alveoli, if I were to look at the airway, I'm going to have a structure that kind of looks something like this. I'm going to have this little finger-like tissue jutting out like so. And then I'm going to have these little hair-like projections coming out of that tissue. And then I'm going to have a layer of tissue under that. And then I'm going to have some muscle. And then I'll have a thick layer of what's known as hyaline cartilage. All right. And then I'm going to have the outside of the body. So this is maybe my neck. All right. And then this is the inside of the trachea. All right. So this finger-like tissue with the little hair-like projections coming off of it, this tissue, and this is not something that I believe you'll be tested on, but this tissue is known as pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. Say that 10 times, right? Pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. And the pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue is covered in, what are these little hair-like projections called that come out of that tissue? The little tiny little hair-like projections. What are they known as? Cilia, yeah. This is ciliated tissue. And then what you have is tissue underneath the pseudostratified columnar epithelial, and this tissue here contains a series of glands. One of the major glands are known as goblet cells. All right, among other glands, but the goblet cells. And the goblet cells secrete a substance known as mucus. And then they secrete that mucus out, and then that mucus is secreted out on top of the pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue, and it creates a blanket on top of the tissue. Is this new to anybody? Is this something you've never heard of before? Hopefully you've heard of this, because this is pretty basic airway anatomy and physiology. So what's the role of mucus? Why do we have mucus lining the airways?
So that particles will stick to it.
Mucus is sticky. It's sticky and stuff sticks to it. Okay, particulate matter contaminants. And then what happens is those cilia beat, like they have a beating, sweeping motion, and they sweep all of that mucus up to your upper airway. And once that mucus with those contaminants on it gets into your upper airway, what happens?
Cough it up.
You either expectorate it or cough it up, or you swallow it, right? You spit or you swallow. That's what you do with mucus. You get it out of the airway completely. And we know there can be diseases of this. And this mechanism is known as the mucociliary escalator. Okay, the mucociliary escalator. So mucus on top of cilia, and then it acts as an escalator, escalates it up. So it's a mucociliary escalator. We know something as simple as being exposed to smoke can paralyze, quote unquote, those cilia. The cilia quit working, right? And I know I have some smokers in here, okay? I know there's smokers in here, all right? You may say you're not, but sorry, okay? What happens, those of you that have been around smokers, generally you don't smoke at night, right? You go to sleep. What happens when you wake up in the morning sometimes, before you have that first cigarette? They cough stuff up, right? And what happens is smoking a cigarette can paralyze those cilia. So you have your cilia paralyzed, and you go to bed, and you're not smoking, so the cilia start working again, and there's all this crap in your lungs, and they start sweeping it up. And then when you wake up in the morning, your airway's like, hey, surprise, I cleaned everything up for you, cough this stuff out. And then you go and you smoke, and you paralyze the cilia, and it becomes a real vicious cycle. Something we'll talk about, the physiology, pathophysiology, that in more detail. But yeah. And then you have a hyaline cartilage, and just like I said, as you go deeper and deeper, the more generations of airway that you encounter, okay, the thinner that hyaline cartilage gets, until you don't have any hyaline cartilage, and it's just wraps of muscle. Okay. I should also say that the parasympathetic nervous system innervates these goblet cells. So when the parasympathetic nervous system is activated, it acts on those goblet cells and causes them to secrete more mucus. Okay, dump more mucus out into your airways. So that's why sometimes agents, anticholinergic agents like atrovent or ibuprofen, can help dry these secretions out, or atropine can help dry airway secretions out. And that may or may not be a good thing, depending on what's going on. Is everybody okay with that? You guys good with that? Okay. So then I move down into the lower airways, the alveoli themselves. And the alveoli, if I look at an alveolus, which is just the single, all right, looks something like this. And the alveoli have a blood supply, all right. So they have a capillary, goes through. And I have blood that comes in, we'll say it's going to come in from this way. It's deoxygenated. Everybody's okay there? It's deoxygenated. And it comes in, and what happens is you have O2, oxygen molecules. All right. So if oxygen molecules diffuse into the alveoli, right? And then the oxygen molecules diffuse across the alveoli into the blood. Everybody's okay with that? And for diffusion to occur, there has to be a gradient. And what do I mean by gradient? What I mean is there has to be more oxygen in the alveoli, the alveolus in this case, than there is in the blood. Because if there was more oxygen in the blood, then oxygen would diffuse out of the blood. Does that make sense? So there needs to be a driving gradient. Okay, there needs to be concentration gradient. And likewise, the concentration of CO2 is higher in the capillaries than the alveoli, so carbon dioxide will diffuse out across the alveolar capillary, or the AC membrane in the alveolus. The alveoli contain three major types of cells. Okay, they contain three major types of cells. They contain the type 1. They contain type 1 alveolar pneumocytes and type 2 alveolar pneumocytes. Okay, the type 1 alveolar pneumocytes make up the general membrane, the general shape of the general structure. Okay, they're like the walls of the alveoli. The type 2 alveolar pneumocytes are embedded in that wall, and they are cells that secrete surfactant. Okay, so your primary structure, your basement structure, your foundation are the type 1 alveolar pneumocytes, and the type 2 alveolar pneumocytes secrete surfactant. And then in the alveoli, or the alveolus in this case, cells, you have immune cells, okay, known as the alveolar macrophage. Okay, the alveolar macrophage. What type of cells is a macrophage?
Clean up, or
They do. The phagocytosis is a major role of the macrophage. They are phagocytic, and that means that they basically engulf and quote unquote eat stuff up. They eat garbage up. A macrophage is nothing more than a monocyte. Okay, it's a monocyte, and has anyone ever seen this? It's an old movie with Chris Rock and Bill Murray. Okay, it's such a good movie. Osmosis Jones. Chris Rock plays Osmosis Jones, right? He is a monocyte, and what is he able to do? What's his superpower? Kind of. He's able to pop in and out of different tissues, right? And morph around. And when monocytes leave the circulatory system and enter other tissues, we call them macrophage. So there you go, Osmosis Jones. There's some learning to be had with that movie, right? I'm dating myself slightly, but that's all right. All right. That was back before Bill Murray got into his serious, dramatic, work. All right. So moving on. So for oxygen to diffuse, you have to have sufficient surface area. The more surface area you have, the more likely it is for oxygen to diffuse in and CO2 to diffuse out. Imagine that this room is an alveoli, okay? Or an alveolus. And we're molecules. And we want to get out of this room. How do we get out of this room? We go through the door, right? Now let's say that all of us need to get out of this room very efficiently. What are we going to do? Huh?
Form a line.
Okay, let's say that a mad gunner busts through this window and starts shooting. What are we going to do?
Run.
We're all going to run and scream toward the door, and we're all going to go get bottled up, okay? So what if I had 10 doors? Would it be a lot easier to get out of this room real quickly? Yeah, because basically if there's just one door, okay, what's the chance that any one of us can get out of this room at any given time? It's pretty low. One of us might get through the door, but then everybody else is going to get piled up behind. But if I had 10 doors, then we could just go right on through. And think of a door as it has a certain amount of surface area. So the more surface area I have that can allow people to exit this room, the more efficiently we can move in and out of this room. So surface area is very important for the diffusion of gas. And anyone take a guess at how much surface area healthy lungs have, if you were to guess. We're going to lay the lungs out and lay out all that surface area. What would you have? You'd have about the surface area of an entire tennis court. Yeah, so you have a significant amount of surface area in your lungs. Yeah, you need that. What is the purpose of surfactant? Why do we have surfactant? Why do I have surfactant that's secreted and lines the alveolus? What's that?
To keep them open?
It's to keep them open, yeah. It's to decrease surface tension, okay? Because of surface tension has a tendency to want to cause the alveoli to collapse. And what's the term for large amounts of alveoli that collapse? There's a term that you'll want to know. It's atelectasis, or atelectasis, absolutely. Okay, so surfactant decreases the surface tension, allows the alveoli to stay open, and there is a physical principle known as the law of Laplace. Okay, I don't know that does it talk about the law of Laplace in the book? Probably not. Paramedic book is pretty general stuff.
It does.
Does it? All right. The law of Laplace basically states that if I take a sphere, okay, the more open something is, the less tension there's going to be. And this makes sense because if you're going to blow up a balloon, what's the hardest time? If you're going to blow a balloon up, when do you have the hardest time blowing that balloon up? The very beginning when it's all deflated, right? But once you get it popped open a little bit, then it's really easy to inflate it. That's the law of Laplace right there. Alveoli can be modeled like balloons or like spheres. And when alveoli are all shrunken and collapsed down, it takes much more work to actually get them open than if the alveoli were kind of opened up a little bit to begin with. Does that make sense? And the surfactant helps prevent them from collapsing when you exhale. Otherwise, they would collapse, and then every time you inhale, you'd have to get them to pop open again, and that would be a lot of energy, and it could injure the alveoli as they're popping open and collapsing. And there are many conditions where you can have surfactant problems. Okay, how's everybody doing? I'm going to go for about another 10 minutes and we'll get you guys on a little break, okay? All right. Let's talk a little bit about the regulation of breathing, okay? How is my breathing regulated? Where's the control center for breathing? What organ is the control center in? Let's start there. What organ is the control center for breathing?
Medulla.
Okay, cool, fair enough. It's in the brain, but yeah, okay, right, the brain, but the medulla, yeah, you're absolutely right. So when you talk about the brain stem, okay, I have a drawing. I don't know if you have a drawing of the center, the respiratory centers in the book or not. We're going to talk about them a little bit. Imagine that, okay, we've done a slice like this, okay? Imagine it's a horror movie and some blade has gone through me and sliced me in half, and half of my body's fallen over, okay, and you're looking at my brain. Yeah, 13 ghosts, right? No, that's the wrong way. He fell this way, right? No, I went lateral, right along my midline. So imagine that, a horror movie, I've been sliced right along my midline, half my body has just fallen down, okay? And before everyone starts screaming and running around, imagine you just looking at my organs. That's what you're going to see. So this is a lower part of the brain, and then I've just drawn this, and this is a pituitary gland, just to kind of give you an idea of where we're at. So this is anterior, this is posterior, okay? Or what's another term for anterior? Starts with a V, ventral, and then dorsal, okay? All right, so this is the brain stem, and then I have the higher brain sitting on top of the brain stem. So we're talking about the lower brain. The cerebellum would be right about here, okay? I'd have the thalamus up here. Okay, so let me go ahead and label some of the components here. So what is the lowest part of the brain stem down here? What area is this called here? Because your brainstem is divided into different sections. What's the lowest section? Anybody? It's the medulla. Okay, so this is the medulla down here. All right, this is a medulla down here. I'll just draw pituitary. All right, so it's a medulla down there, and then what's kind of this area here, middle? This area right here. No, cerebellum, no, that's all. I took all that away. We're just talking about the brainstem. Just the brainstem, that's all. This is the pons right here. The pons. Right, the pons sits on top of the medulla. Everybody cool with that? And then you have the mesoencephalon up here, and the diencephalon in the upper brain, but you don't have to worry about that right now. Okay, cool. I have 4 different centers in the medulla, in the brainstem as a whole. Okay, 2 of them are more or less in the pons, and 2 of them are more or less in the medulla. Okay? The first one is known as the pneumotaxic center. All right, the pneumotaxic center. Okay, and then right basically underneath the pneumotaxic center is the apneustic center. The apneustic center. And then I have 2 centers down here in the medulla, and they're known as the respiratory groups. And the one that is ventral is known as the ventral respiratory group, or the VRG. And then the one that is dorsal is known as the dorsal respiratory group, or the DRG. Is everybody cool with that? Now, what happens is these centers can be inhibitory, okay, they can inhibit, or they can enhance breathing, depending on what's going on. Big picture, the pneumotaxic center is generally more inhibitory, okay? It's the major center of inhibition, so maybe I'll just put like a negative, a big minus here. It's the major center of inhibition. It's a part of the, it's like, okay, stop breathing, you get yourself a pneumothorax, and you keep inhaling, stop, okay? And it kind of sends inhibitory signals to the rest of the groups. The apneustic center, I believe, is both inhibitory and it can enhance, okay? And the ventral and dorsal respiratory groups are more or less enhancing. They more or less enhance, initiate breathing. And then, of course, the pneumotaxic can send signals to the apneustic, which can send signals back to the pneumotaxic, and then signals can also be sent, okay, to the ventral and dorsal respiratory group. Is everybody cool with that? So these are your breathing centers. So these breathing centers have to receive data. They have to receive input, right? Something has to tell these centers, hey, I think the lungs need to work. I think the lungs need to do their job, right? And that input can either be chemotaxic input, which is chemical, or some sort of sensory input, which is ultimately chemical as well, but there you have it. Now, let's talk about the sensory, the tactile input, okay? That input is going to come mainly from the lungs and the airway. And that input is going to move up through afferent pathways. You guys remember afferent versus efferent neural pathways? Afferent neural pathways are ascending. Sensory information moves up through afferent pathways. And then motor information from the brain out to the body, it moves through efferent pathways, okay? So I have sensory input coming, and primarily what I have sensory input coming from receptors in the airway and the lungs, okay? I have irritation or irritant, okay? I have irritation receptors, and I have stretch receptors. All right, and then you have other things like J receptors. Joyce would kill me if I didn't say J receptor because she's got a big thing for the J receptors. The juxtaglomerular receptors, which I don't even know what they do. I don't think anyone does. But Joyce really likes them, so I've got to mention that there are J receptors in your lung as well. All right, there you go. But basically, you have irritation and stretch receptors, okay? So if an irritation receptor sends information up, this may say, hey, stop breathing, right? If have you ever gotten like a whiff of smoke? What happens when you get a whiff of smoke? Like from a campfire, it's really smoky, and that smoke hits you, what happens? Yeah, you stop breathing, and then you start going, coughing, right? Just try to get that out. And that is because that smoke has irritated receptors in your upper and maybe even your lower airways, depending on how far those particles got in your body. And then you have stretch receptors, okay? And stretch receptors in your lungs measure how much stretching there is, and once your lungs has stretched out enough, the stretch receptors go, okay, that's enough inhalation. Information goes up to the pneumotaxic. The pneumotaxic tells the VRG and DRG, okay, don't inhale anymore. Let's go ahead and exhale. Everybody's good with that? There is a reflex based on these stretch mechanism. And you will want to know this reflex. Okay? It is known as the Herring-Brewer reflex. It should talk about it in the book. Okay? And the Herring-Brewer reflex is a reflex based on stretching of the lungs. And once the lungs get stretched to a certain point, they will send information that inhibits breathing. So that prevents you from overexpanding your lungs. Okay? So Herring-Brewer reflex prevents overexpansion. It's a protective reflex. There are other protective mechanisms. You talked about coughing. Coughing is another major protective mechanism. And then what is the last protective mechanism? It's primarily upper airway.
Like the mammalian thing? Is that what you're talking
No,
about?
that's
I don't know.
the gag reflex, right? Yeah. So gagging, coughing, and Herring-Brewer reflexes are all the three major protective reflexes. And then you could throw sneezing in there as well. You know, sneezing is also a protective mechanism as well. So you have those four there. All right. So I have this irritation and stretch information coming up. That's primarily inhibitory, right? What actually is the major mechanism by which we initiate breathing? What's the major mechanism, guys?
Hypoxic drive?
No. No.
That we initiate
Yeah. You're on the right path. It's chemotaxic. It is information that is chemical in nature, okay? And you have this, excuse me, you have this information coming from what are known as chemoreceptors. You have chemoreceptors that are located peripherally, okay? So chemoreceptors, peripheral chemoreceptors, and when I say peripheral, I mean peripheral to the brain, are located in the aortic arch, I believe, is one major area, where you have chemoreceptors. So you have your peripheral chemoreceptors. Okay. And then you also have chemoreceptors in the brain, or what we call central chemoreceptors. All right, central chemoreceptors. Located in the brain that measure pH. Okay, they measure pH. And pH is the primary mechanism by which we breathe. It is pH changes. Okay? When our pH gets low, we become what? A low pH is high acid, right? We become acidic, and that is the primary stimulus to breathe. When your pH gets low, that low pH is detected by peripheral and central chemoreceptors, and they send information to the VRG, DRG, and tell these guys, start breathing. Okay? When your pH gets really high, you have inhibitory signals moving in. Does that make sense? So it is pH, your drive to breathe is primarily a pH mechanism. Now, most people will say that it is CO2, okay? Which is true in a sense. That's not entirely false, but it's not the carbon dioxide itself. It's the fact that carbon dioxide is turned into an acid in your body. Carbon dioxide is transformed into carbonic acid, right? So it's not the carbon dioxide necessarily, it's the fact that that carbon dioxide is transformed into carbonic acid, which then dissociates into hydrogen ions, or carbon ions, and those hydrogen ions that actually change your pH. So your drive to breathe is primarily a pH-dependent mechanism, and then a very small part of that, okay, a very small part of that is what's known as a hypoxic mechanism. There is a small component known as the hypoxic drive, very, very small, not a big, doesn't play a big role at all, hardly at all. When you hold your breath and you feel that urge to breathe, that is not because you're hypoxic. That is not hypoxia that's telling you, breathe, breathe. That is the buildup of CO2, which is then being turned into carbonic acid, which is dropping your pH. Okay, so, and actually there are divers that can kind of get around this, and what they do is they hyperventilate for several minutes, and maybe they hyperventilate with oxygen, they blow off all their CO2, and then they can dive a lot longer, because they can get around that mechanism. In fact, some of them are so good at it, what happens is they become hypoxic before their CO2 levels get high enough to tell them to breathe. And then what happens is they can actually black out from hypoxia, but they don't have any drive to breathe. They're hypoxic, but remember, hypoxic drive is just a very minor part of your respiratory drive. Okay, how are we doing on time? Let's see here, a couple more minutes and I gotta let you guys go. You know what, this next part, talking about volumes, capacities, let's just go ahead and give you guys a break. Take 10 minutes, and then we will talk about volumes, capacities, muscles of breathing, etc.